Please don't hurt us." The woman's voice trembled in the darkness, her body shielding a golden retriever huddled against her, both of them trembling with cold and terror. Jesse Carter froze in the doorway of what was supposed to be an empty farmhouse, his military instincts screaming danger before his civilian mind could even process the scene unfolding before him. She wasn't supposed to be here. Nobody was supposed to be here. He'd bought this abandoned property specifically because it was isolated, forgotten, a fresh start for him and his 7-year-old daughter Lily, after years of struggling through a life that had stripped away everything he thought defined him. The woman's eyes locked onto his, wide with terror, glistening with unshed tears, and Jesse saw something else beneath the fear, something that made his heart clench with recognition. The look of someone in real danger, the kind that changed everything, the kind that made a person willing to protect another at any cost. But before we find out what happens next, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below telling us where you're listening from right now. I'd love to hear from you. Whether you're at work, at home, or somewhere in between, your stories matter. All right, let me tell you how Jesse ended up here and why this moment would change both their lives forever. 7 years ago, Jesse Carter had everything a Navy SEAL could dream of. The unit was his family in the truest sense. More than blood relatives, more than friends. These were men who would die for you, men you would die for, men who understood the weight of secrets and sacrifice better than anyone in the civilian world ever could. He'd earned his trident through pure determination, the only child of a distant father who'd demanded excellence as the price of attention. Jesse had learned to excel, to push his body beyond what it should endure, to make split-second decisions that meant life and death. His mind had been sharpened through dozens of operational deployments, from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, to places that didn't appear on any official maps. He could navigate by stars, by terrain, by the subtle shifts in wind direction. He could disable an opponent with 4 different combat techniques before they could draw a breath. He could maintain tactical awareness while running on empty for 72 hours straight. The missions were his purpose. The classified operations he could never discuss the reason he woke up every morning. Disarmament operations, hostage rescues, direct action against high-value targets, counter-terrorism work that would never be written into declassified documents. And then there was Emma, his wife, the woman who somehow understood what it meant to be married to someone who lived in the shadows of the world. She never complained about the deployments, the 6-month stretches when he'd simply vanish into operational planning and combat missions. She never asked questions about the classified work he couldn't discuss. She never expressed resentment about the midnight emergencies when he'd have to leave her bed at 2 a.m., the helicopter landing to extract him from their civilian life. She just loved him, supported him, and waited for him to come home. And he always came home, until the one thing he couldn't fight, the one enemy that military training and Navy SEAL discipline couldn't defeat, came for her. The cancer diagnosis came when Jesse was on a mission in Southeast Asia. He was somewhere he couldn't discuss with anyone he didn't have security clearance to tell, doing something that might never be written into the official record books, living in a state of constant tactical awareness. Then the call came through. Not official channels. His sister had somehow gotten his secure satellite number. Emma had gone to her doctors for a routine checkup. They'd found something bad. Jesse got his commanding officer to give him emergency leave, the CO's face grave as he briefed him on the helicopter that would extract him within the hour. 24 hours later, he was back in the United States, driving his truck through the night to the hospital where Emma was being admitted for a battery of tests. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He'd been trained to control his fear response, to compartmentalize emotion and focus on the mission, but his mind kept circling back to Emma's voice on that satellite call, the tremor in her words, the clinical way she'd described her symptoms before asking him to come home. The wait for results was the longest 72 hours of his life. He sat in hospital waiting rooms painted in soothing colors designed to calm anxiety, but they only made him feel more trapped. He'd been through Hell Week training where instructors used psychological torture to break SEAL candidates. He'd been shot at in 3 different countries. He'd made decisions that meant life and death for people under his command. But nothing compared to the terror of sitting in a hospital waiting room, holding his wife's trembling hand, watching the color drain from her face as a doctor explained oncology options in gentle, clinical language that couldn't hide the reality that his wife's body was attacking itself. Stage 3. Advanced. She was 30 years old. Emma was only 30 years old. Jessie remembered the way she looked at him when the doctor delivered the news. She was so calm, so logical about it, like she was reading a quarterly report instead of hearing about the thing that would destroy their world. She listed treatment options with clinical precision: chemotherapy, radiation, experimental immunotherapy trials, surgery to remove the tumors. She was already in problem-solving mode, already thinking about survival, already being brave in a way that broke Jesse's heart into pieces he didn't think could be put back together. He flew home on emergency leave and took a leave extension, then another and another. Emma didn't ask him to stay. She understood his duty, understood his commitment to his brothers in the unit. But her eyes asked it. Every time she looked at him, especially after the treatment started and the side effects began to ravage her body, her eyes asked, "Will you stay? Please stay." He'd wake in the night to her vomiting in the bathroom, her body convulsing from chemotherapy, and he'd hold her hair back and watch the woman he loved disappear incrementally, cell by cell, day by day. He attended oncology appointments and learned medical terminology he'd never wanted to know. He watched his wife lose her hair, her strength, her weight, her color. He watched her remain brave through all of it. So Jesse made a choice. He filed for discharge from the Navy. His commanding officer tried to convince him to stay, to take a different posting that would let him be stateside, to consider his future and the pension he'd lose if he left early. But Jesse couldn't imagine putting on a uniform and focusing on someone else's operation while his wife was fighting for her life. He couldn't do it. The SEAL teams had been his identity for 20 years, had shaped him into something stronger and harder than an ordinary man. But Emma mattered more than his identity. Emma mattered more than his career. They gave him an honorable discharge, 6 months of separation paperwork, and a genuine sense that they understood he was doing the right thing, even as they mourned losing a highly trained operator. His brothers in the unit came to say goodbye, came to thank him for his service, came to acknowledge the weight of what he was giving up. Some of them didn't understand the choice. How could you leave when the team needed you, when your country needed you, when you dedicated your entire adult life to the mission? But most of them understood that there was a different kind of mission happening in his civilian life, one that demanded everything he had to give. Jesse became a civilian, something he never thought he'd be, something that felt like shedding his entire identity and stepping into an unknown void. Emma fought hard for 2 years, really fought, with a tenacity that reminded Jesse why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She did chemotherapy until her hair fell out, and she bought beautiful scarves, silk ones in jewel tones that framed her face. She did radiation until her skin burned, and she wore soft clothing that didn't irritate the damage. She participated in experimental treatments that might or might not work, signing consent forms and getting injected with drugs that had long names and uncertain outcomes. She did everything the doctors suggested, everything the support groups recommended, everything that anyone could possibly do. But the cancer didn't care about her will. It didn't care about her determination or her love for her daughter or her dreams about the future. It simply grew, metastasizing from her lungs to her lymph nodes to her bones, methodically destroying the architecture of her body from the inside out. Jesse watched it happen and couldn't stop it. He, who had been trained to stop things, to overcome impossible odds, to save lives in combat zones, he couldn't save the one person who mattered most. And that failure became a weight he carried every single day after Emma died. She passed on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Lily was 1 year old. Jesse was holding Emma's hand, feeling the bony thinness of it, watching the shallow rise and fall of her breathing become slower and slower until finally there was no breath at all. In one moment she was his wife. In the next moment she was gone. And he was alone with a 1-year-old daughter and a future that felt like drowning in slow motion. The next 6 years were a blur of survival. Jesse was 32 years old, a single father, completely and utterly lost in ways he'd never experienced during his military career. He'd faced death in combat, had made decisions under impossible pressure, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet desperation of being alone with a 1-year-old daughter and a grief that felt like drowning in slow motion. People reached out. Emma's family, his military friends, counselors and therapists who understood combat trauma. But nobody could reach the darkness he'd fallen into. He was drowning in his own living room, surrounded by well-meaning people who couldn't comprehend the weight of what he was carrying. He went through the motions. He applied for custody, which was never in doubt. Courts didn't hesitate to grant a decorated Navy SEAL honorable custody of his biological daughter. He accepted Emma's life insurance, which gave him enough to buy a modest apartment near her parents' house so they could help with childcare. Lily would grow up knowing her grandparents, would have more stability, more love, more hands to hold her when her father was drowning. He started looking for work, but the nightmares came every night. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat, now making him see threats in everyday situations, the inability to be still making it impossible to hold a typical job. The Navy wanted him back. They offered him positions, told him his discharge could be reversed, promised him support and understanding. But Jesse couldn't imagine putting on a uniform while his daughter grew up with babysitters, couldn't imagine missing the early years of her childhood, couldn't imagine being part of a world that took people away from their families. So he looked for civilian work instead. His options were limited. He had no college degree, no civilian job experience, no network outside the military. What he had was strong hands, discipline, physical fitness, and a willingness to work jobs that other people didn't want. So he became a janitor. He started with a cleaning service that operated out of a small office in downtown Norfolk, Virginia. The pay was barely minimum wage, but the shifts were flexible. He could work nights after Lily was asleep, cleaning office buildings while the city slept. He could be home when she woke up, could make her breakfast, could take her to daycare, could be present in the way his own father never had been. It wasn't glorious work. It wasn't who he'd been for 2 decades. But it paid the bills and kept him present in his daughter's life, and he did it without complaint, without resentment, with the kind of steady determination that came from understanding that being a father mattered more than being a Navy SEAL. His co-workers at the cleaning service didn't know who he really was. They knew him as Quiet Jesse, the guy who always showed up on time, who worked harder than anyone else, who never complained about the worst assignments or the most disgusting bathrooms. They knew him as someone reliable, dependable, maybe a little bit strange because he didn't talk much and never joined them for beers after work. What they didn't know was that he was a Navy SEAL. What they didn't know was that every night, after work, he went home to a daughter who was the center of his universe. What they didn't know was that he was saving every penny toward a dream that felt so fragile he was terrified to speak it out loud. He wanted to own a home, A real home, not an apartment, not a rental that could be taken away at the landlord's whim. A place where Lily could have roots, where she could plant a garden, where she could know the safety of having somewhere that was theirs and nobody could ever take it away. The farmhouse appeared in his life almost by accident, like fate had been waiting for the right moment to hand him what he needed. Jesse was cleaning offices in a real estate building, pushing his mop cart down the hallway, when a broker's desk caught his eye. The listing was for a 1970s farmhouse on 15 acres in rural Virginia, outside a small town called Millbrook. The house was abandoned for 5 years, required significant structural repairs, and was priced at an amount that seemed impossibly cheap. The photos showed a property that had been loved once, that had good bones, but had been neglected for so long that it had started to crumble. Jesse stood there looking at those photos for 40 minutes, long enough that he was sure he'd be caught. Nobody caught him. He wrote down the address and the real estate agent's number, and he spent his lunch break sitting in his truck, holding a cup of cold coffee, imagining what it would be like to own that place. The real estate agent nearly fell over when Jesse called and asked to see the property. The farmhouse had been listed for 2 years with no serious offers. Most people wanted properties that were move-in ready, that didn't require years of renovation and money they didn't have. Jesse was one of the first people to express genuine interest. When he saw the house in person, standing on the front steps with the real estate agent, he knew. He just knew. The farmhouse was exactly what he'd been looking for, without understanding what he was looking for. It was isolated, 40 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but fields and trees and sky. It was defensible in ways he could appreciate through his military training. Good sight lines, multiple exits, far enough from neighbors that nobody would bother him. And most importantly, it was affordable. Barely. But it was possible. He made an offer that day. It was accepted immediately. Nobody else wanted the place, and the bank that held it was just grateful to finally dump the liability. Jesse started the process of qualifying for a mortgage, something he'd never expected to be able to do on his janitor's salary. But his credit was good, his employment history was steady, and the down payment he'd saved was just large enough to make the numbers work. 4 months later, on a cold November morning, Jesse and his 7-year-old daughter pulled up to their new home in a rented truck loaded with everything they owned. Lily had never been to the farmhouse before. Jesse had wanted to wait until it was theirs, officially and legally, before he brought her here. As she climbed out of the truck, her eyes growing wide as she looked at the house, at the sprawling property, at the fields that stretched out in every direction, Jesse saw something shift in her expression. She saw what he saw. She saw home. "Is this ours, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and wondering. "Yes, baby," he said, kneeling down to her eye level. "This is ours. Forever." The farmhouse needed everything. The roof leaked in 3 different places. The windows rattled in their frames during even gentle breezes. The electrical system was vintage in a way that was actively dangerous. Jerry-rigged additions made by previous owners who didn't know what they were doing. Outlets that sparked when you plugged things in. A circuit breaker box that looked like a fire hazard waiting to happen. The plumbing was temperamental at best, non-functional at worst. The kitchen hadn't been updated since 1983. The bathrooms looked like they'd been modeled after a jail cell, but it had solid bones, and Jesse had something more valuable than money. He had military precision, YouTube tutorials, a willingness to work 80-hour weeks, and the kind of motivation that comes from wanting to create something beautiful for your daughter. He worked every weekend while Lily played in the yard or helped with simple tasks, slowly transforming the place into a home. He wasn't there for financial investment or to flip the property for profit. He was there because every nail he drove, every board he replaced, every light fixture he installed was a promise to his daughter. This is ours, and it matters. 2 months into living in the farmhouse, on a bitter cold February night with snow piling up outside and the wind howling around the eaves, Jesse's life was about to change in ways he couldn't have predicted. He was working the evening shift, cleaning office buildings in Richmond, doing his job with the same quiet competence that defined everything he did. His neighbour, Mrs. Patterson, had Lily for the night. It was a Friday, which meant he had Saturday and Sunday to work on the house before Lily came home. He came home around 11 p.m., pulling into the long driveway, his headlights cutting through the darkness. He'd left the porch light on before he left, a habit from his military days. Always know what you're coming home to. Always maintain situational awareness. The light was off. Jesse's mind shifted immediately. Not into panic, but into tactical awareness, the training that had been embedded in him over 2 decades of military service. His hand tightened on the steering wheel. He pulled past the house and parked the truck on the far side of the property, out of sight from the road, in a spot where he'd have maximum visibility if he needed to defend the position. He got out slowly, carefully, keeping to the shadows and away from the porch lights that weren't on. The back door was slightly ajar. Jesse knew he'd locked it when he left. He always locked doors, always maintained security, which meant someone had opened it. Someone was inside his house. His hand went to his keys, selecting the oldest one, using it like brass knuckles, his knuckles curling around it in the way he'd been trained. Combat instinct made him approach the back door instead of the front, making no noise on the porch steps, keeping to the shadows that pooled behind the trees. He could hear something, a sound that made his blood freeze and then flood with adrenaline. A woman was whispering to someone. Her voice was urgent, terrified, and so full of desperation that it cut through Jesse's defensive posture. He moved toward the sound, his body automatically dropping into a crouch, his breathing controlled and silent. His mind was processing threat assessment. Armed? How many? Where are the exits? How quickly can I neutralize the situation? But something else, something he couldn't quite name, made him approach with caution instead of aggression. She was in the sitting room, a space off the kitchen that they'd never really used in the 2 months since moving in. In the darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow from the window where the moon caught the snow outside, Jesse saw her. A woman who looked to be in her early 30s, dark hair soaking wet, her expensive designer coat hanging off her shoulders in tatters. She was shivering violently, her lips blue with cold, and next to her, shivering even more severely, was a golden retriever. "Please don't hurt us," she whispered when she saw Jesse's shadow in the doorway. Her hand had moved to the dog's collar, her entire body positioning itself protectively between the animal and this stranger. "I don't have anything. Please, just let us go. I'll disappear. Nobody has to know we were ever here." Jesse's military training had prepared him for combat situations, for identifying threats, for rapid decision-making under impossible pressure. But it had never quite prepared him for the specific terror in a woman's voice, or the way she positioned herself to protect a dog, putting herself between the animal and potential danger. He recognized what he was seeing. Not a criminal, not a threat, but someone in genuine danger, and she was more concerned about protecting another living creature than about her own safety. He'd seen soldiers risk their lives to protect civilians, had watched good people put themselves in harm's way for people they'd never met. He was watching that same instinct now in a civilian woman protecting a scared dog. He raised his hands slowly, making sure she could see them in the dim light, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, the way you approached an injured animal that might strike out of fear. He kept his voice low and steady, the same tone he used to calm Lily during thunderstorms, the voice he'd learned years ago that could soothe fear without dismissing it. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you. This is my house. I live here. I'm Jesse." He took another step forward, slowly, giving her time to adjust to his presence, reading her body language the way he'd been trained, her breathing rate, the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes tracked his movements. "Are you hurt? Are you bleeding?" The woman's eyes were still locked on him, calculating, assessing, intelligent eyes that were taking his measure the way he was taking hers. Her hand tightened on the dog's collar, but she didn't try to run. The dog was pressed against her side, a golden mass of soaking wet fur and trembling muscles, and Jessie could see that the dog's fear matched the woman's fear. Are you alone?" she asked. Her voice was different now, less terrified, more calculating, like she was switching from pure survival mode to actual assessment. The question itself was loaded with meaning. "Are you a threat? Do you have others waiting outside? Are you going to hurt me? Are there men coming after you who might be with this person? Is this a situation I can survive?" Jessie understood exactly what she was asking, and he understood the calculation she was making. "I'm alone," he said truthfully, his voice steady and clear. "My daughter is with a babysitter tonight. It's just me and this house, and apparently it's also you and your dog." He gestured around the dark space, letting her see the emptiness, the lack of threat. "What's your dog's name?" "Maxwell," she said, almost automatically, like the dog's name was the only solid thing left in her dissolving world. Her hand moved to stroke his head, a gesture of comfort more for herself than for the dog. "Maxwell is a good name," Jessie said. He gestured slowly toward the sitting room. "Why don't we turn on some lights, get you and Maxwell warmed up? I can make you both some hot tea, something warm in your belly. We can talk about what happened, or we don't have to talk at all if you're not ready, but staying in the cold and dark isn't going to help either of you. What do you say?" She hesitated for another long moment, fear warring with something else. Hope, maybe, or desperation, or the knowledge that staying in the cold and dark was going to kill her faster than trusting this stranger. Finally she nodded, a small movement that communicated both surrender and calculated risk. Jessie moved carefully to the lamp beside the old couch, clicking it on. The light was weak, casting long shadows across the room, but it illuminated everything, and he finally saw her clearly. She was beautiful in the way that wealth and privilege usually marked a person, her face delicate and refined, her eyes intelligent and calculating even through the fear. Her clothing, despite being damaged and soaking wet, was expensive, high-end, designer labels. The kind of quality that told Jessie this woman was from a completely different world than the one he inhabited, not just different socio-economically, but from a different reality entirely. "I'm Sophia," she said quietly, as if introducing herself would somehow make her less of an intruder, would legitimize her presence in his home. "This is Maxwell. He's safe. He won't hurt you. He's actually scared of loud noises and thunderstorms and his own shadow. But I love him, and I needed to keep him safe. I couldn't leave him behind." "Jessie," he replied, moving toward the kitchen. "Come on, let's get you both warm. The dog can stay in here by the fireplace. When's the last time you've eaten?" He wasn't thinking strategically in that moment, wasn't assessing the risk-benefit analysis of helping a stranger. He was just responding to the basic human impulse to help someone in need, and his military training, instead of fighting against it, simply shifted into supporting it. He got a fire going in the sitting room, found dry clothes for Sophia that wouldn't fit properly, but would provide warmth, made her hot tea with honey, and heated up the leftover pot roast he'd made for dinner. Maxwell dried off by the fire, his golden coat gradually returning to its normal fluffy appearance, and the dog's shivering slowly subsided. Sophia sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket Jessie had provided, sipping tea with both hands, and slowly her color came back. Her lips went from blue to pale to almost normal. Her eyes, which had been wild with terror, became more focused. As he was taking her measure, the raw fear, the exhaustion, the way her hands still trembled even as she accepted his help, Jesse made a decision that would completely upend the carefully constructed new life he'd been building for himself and his daughter. He decided to help her. He didn't know who she was yet or why she was hiding in his abandoned farmhouse in the middle of the night. But something in his military instincts, the part that had been trained to protect the vulnerable and stand against injustice, recognized that Sophia Brooks wasn't a random criminal or a security threat. She was someone running from something serious, or someone she was genuinely terrified of. And that was all he needed to know to decide he was going to help her. He was right to trust that instinct, even if he had no idea what he was about to get involved in. The coffee was hot and strong when Sophia finally found the words to tell him everything. Her hands wrapped around the mug, like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality, like letting go would mean falling into an abyss from which there was no return. Maxwell was curled up by the fireplace in the sitting room, finally warm, finally safe, his golden coat gleaming in the firelight, like he'd been restored to the beautiful dog he'd been before trauma and fear had taken their toll. Lily's absence from the house meant this was the one place Sophia could safely speak, and Jesse waited, patient, giving her space and time while she gathered the courage to explain why she was hiding in an abandoned Virginia farmhouse. "My ex-husband," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's a United States congressman, fourth-term representative from California. We met 12 years ago. He was a rising star in politics. I was building my first software company. I'd founded it when I was 24, out of my garage, writing encryption algorithms in the middle of the night. By the time I was 30, my company had been valued at over $200 million. We specialized in cybersecurity solutions for financial institutions and government agencies. I had clients across America, in Europe, in Asia. I was building something real, something meaningful. Everyone thought we were the perfect couple. He had the political power. I had the innovation and wealth. We looked good in photos at fundraisers. The press loved us. The future looked golden, inevitable." Her voice cracked slightly. "But after about 3 years of marriage, I realized the man I married didn't exist. The person I was living with was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous." Jesse sat across from her, his expression neutral, but his tactical mind was already processing the implications. If she had that kind of wealth and power, what she was telling him had to be extraordinary for her to run. He'd seen enough darkness in his military career to know that money and power often concealed terrible things. He'd watched good people get corrupted by the systems they served, watched honorable men and women gradually transform into something else when enough power and pressure was applied. The ambitious young congressman probably seemed perfect for a woman like Sophia, someone equally ambitious, equally intelligent, but something had changed. "What changed?" he asked quietly. "I started noticing things," Sophia continued, and as she talked, Jesse recognized the signs of someone who'd been working through this story in her head, rehearsing it, trying to find a way to make other people understand something so vast and terrible that it felt almost impossible to explain. Money that didn't match his Senate salary, and believe me, Senate salaries are generous, but his were off. Conversations that ended abruptly when I walked into a room, late-night meetings with people who had that particular look, the way some of your military guys looked, if you know what I mean. Like they were trained for things that couldn't be discussed in polite conversation. Jesse nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. "I'm smart, Jesse, really smart. I didn't build my software company from nothing by being careless or trusting in things that didn't add up. So I started looking deeper. I used the exact same encryption-breaking techniques I'd developed for my cybersecurity clients to access his encrypted servers. I tracked his communications through the dark web, followed his digital footprint through channels he thought were untraceable. I copied files, dozens of terabytes of data, everything stored in encrypted cloud servers that I created under false identities. And what I found... She trailed off, her grip tightening on the mug until Jessie worried the ceramic might break. "What did you find?" Jessie prompted gently. "Everything," Sophia said flatly. "He's involved in money laundering on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. Millions of dollars, Jessie. Billions, maybe. The evidence is meticulous. Bank transfers showing money flowing from legitimate tech companies owned by shell corporations into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, Liechtenstein. The money then gets routed back into American accounts, cleaned and laundered, used to buy real estate, fund businesses, make political contributions. He's the middleman between international criminal organizations and legitimate American businesses. He's connected to people who operate outside the law in ways that make the government itself look complicit. Cartels, oligarchs, organized crime figures. And the worst part, he's been using his political position to cover it all up. Investigations get mysteriously closed. Witnesses disappear. Actual disappearances, Jessie. People who were going to testify against him simply vanished. People who ask questions have their lives destroyed through character assassination, financial ruin, manufactured scandals. And nobody asks how any of this is possible because he's too important, too connected, too protected by the system itself. Federal agents who've tried to investigate him have been mysteriously transferred or pressured into early retirement. DOJ prosecutors who wanted to build cases against him have been reassigned or fired. It's like he exists above the law completely. Jessie felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen corruption in the military, watched good people get burned while bad ones got promoted, witnessed the way power could create its own ecosystem of protection and complicity. But something about the scale of what Sophia was describing made his blood run cold. This wasn't just corruption. This was systematic, organized, insidious, in a way that revealed how completely the rules could be rewritten when you had enough power. "Does he know you found out?" Jessie asked. Sophia nodded, her eyes distant with memory. 2 weeks ago, I confronted him about it. I was naive. I thought because he was my husband, because we'd built a life together, that I could appeal to whatever conscience he still had left. I told him I had the evidence and I was going to the FBI. I thought he'd be angry, sure. I thought he might try to convince me to stay silent, but I never, ever thought he would. She stopped, unable to continue the thought. "Wouldn't what?" Jessie prompted gently. "Wouldn't kill me," she finished flatly. He tried. He had 2 men come to our house that night, both of them with that military bearing I recognized, both of them with clear instructions. They said he'd authorized it, that I was mentally unstable, that I was a threat to myself. They had documentation. They had lawyers ready. They were just going to make me disappear into a psychiatric facility where nobody would ever find me, and nobody would question it because he'd set up the narrative perfectly. He'd already started planting stories about my instability, about how I'd been paranoid, obsessed with conspiracy theories, making wild accusations against him. Who would believe a paranoid, unstable woman when a sitting congressman said she was delusional? Jessie's hands curled into fists. This was exactly the kind of calculated evil he'd spent his Navy SEAL career fighting against. Except this time, it was happening in America, in the system itself, perpetrated by someone the system was designed to protect. "How did you escape?" he asked. "Maxwell," she said, glancing toward the dog sleeping by the fire. "I was with them in a black SUV, heading toward a facility that didn't exist on any public record, toward becoming a disappeared person, and Maxwell started having a seizure. I'd just adopted him 3 weeks before, an abused dog from a rescue, neglected and traumatized, and the stress of the situation triggered something. The driver panicked, losing his professional composure, pulling over abruptly on the side of the highway. He ran around to the back of the vehicle to see what was happening with the dog. His partner, the one sitting next to me, turned to check on Maxwell too. That was the only moment of vulnerability I was going to get. I just ran. I grabbed Maxwell and I ran out of that SUV, and he came with me because he was already terrified and at least I was familiar. And we ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out miles away. We spent nights in homeless shelters, hiding in different towns, moving constantly using buses and trains to make sure they couldn't track us through cameras or license plate readers. Maxwell was the reason I survived. If that dog hadn't had that seizure at exactly that moment, if that one moment of vulnerability hadn't presented itself, I'd be in a psychiatric facility right now, officially declared unstable, medicating into compliance, my evidence deleted, my story dismissed as the ravings of a paranoid woman. She took a shaky breath, and Jessie reached across the table to take her hand. Her fingers were cold, and they gripped his with desperate strength. "I was trying to figure out where to go," Sophia continued. "I realized everyone in my circle was connected to him somehow. Every friend, every business associate, every family member who'd stayed in contact. They all had reasons to turn me in, or reasons to fear what he'd do if they helped me. I felt like the walls were closing in, like there was nowhere safe, like I was running out of options and time. Then I read about this property online, abandoned for 5 years, in the middle of nowhere, Virginia, cheap enough that I could pay cash and leave no paper trail. I thought maybe I could hide here for a while, figure out my next move. I didn't know anyone actually lived here. I was going to leave in the morning, I swear. I just needed one night of safety, one night where I could sleep without hearing footsteps, one night where Maxwell could be warm." She looked at Jessie directly for the first time since she'd started talking, and what he saw in her eyes was vulnerability, but also strength. There was fear, yes, but there was also intelligence, calculation, the mind of someone who'd been fighting for her life and hadn't given up. "I broke in through a window in the back," Sophia said, her voice steady now. "Maxwell was so cold. I found this room, and I built a nest with cushions and blankets. I was going to wait until morning and disappear again. I didn't expect to find anyone home. The house seemed empty, and I wasn't thinking clearly enough to check thoroughly. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for breaking in." Jessie believed her completely. The truth was written across her face, in the exhaustion, in the raw vulnerability. But he also understood the danger, and his military mind was already working through the implications. "You can't stay here," he said finally. "Not because I don't want to help you, but because he's probably already looking. If he has the resources you're describing, if he's connected to people willing to kidnap you and make you disappear, then he has access to professionals, investigators, tracking services, military contractors who specialize in exactly this kind of work. Staying in one place makes you a target." "I know," Sophia said, and the defeat in her voice was crushing to hear. "I've been running for 2 weeks straight. I can't run forever. Eventually I'll get tired, or I'll make a mistake, or I'll run out of money, and then he'll find me." "But," Jessie continued, holding up his hand, "you're going to stay here anyway, at least for tonight. Tomorrow we figure out our next move. I'm going to teach you how to recognize if you're being followed. I'm going to help you secure the evidence you have and make sure it's in a place where it can't be disappeared. And then we're going to destroy him. Not with violence," Jessie clarified, seeing the flash of fear in her eyes at his words. "But we're going to expose him so completely that his only option will be to answer for what he's done." Sophia's head came up sharply, and hope bloomed across her face like a flower opening to sunlight. "You're going to help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jesse thought of his daughter sleeping at his neighbor's house 2 miles away. He thought of the farmhouse he'd worked so hard to restore, every nail driven and every board replaced as a promise to Lily that they had safety, that they had a future, that they had a home. He thought of the life he'd carefully constructed out of the ashes of his military career, the deliberate step away from violence and danger, and the systems that perpetuated injustice. He thought of all of that, and then he thought of Sophia's ex-husband, who represented everything he'd walked away from: abuse of power, corruption, the destruction of good people for profit and influence, the ability to operate above the law because the law itself was designed to protect people like him. "Yeah," he said quietly, his voice steady and certain. "I'm going to help you." The decision to involve himself in Sophia's situation wasn't made lightly, and over the following days, Jesse grappled with the enormity of what he'd committed to. He was no longer a Navy SEAL. He wasn't part of an organization with resources and legal authority and international reach. He was just a single dad working as a janitor, living in a farmhouse he was still renovating, trying to build a normal life. Getting involved in something this dangerous, this complicated, this potentially violent, was he doing the right thing? But the moment Lily came home from her babysitter's the next afternoon and asked about the pretty lady in the guest room, Jesse understood that his decision had already been made by something deeper than logic. It had been made by his values, by his understanding of what was right and wrong, by the part of him that had become a Navy SEAL in the first place because he wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Sophia was terrified of children at first. She came downstairs cautiously when Lily arrived home from school, hanging back in the kitchen like she was afraid her presence would somehow traumatize the girl. But Lily, at 7 years old, possessed the emotional intelligence of someone who understood loneliness at a fundamental level. Her mother was dead, her father worked nights, and she spent most of her time with babysitters or at school. She saw Sophia the same way she probably saw everything in her life, as another lost person trying to figure things out. "Are you sad?" Lily asked Sophia directly, with the blunt honesty only a child could manage. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, her backpack still on her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the woman who'd suddenly appeared in her house. Sophia knelt down to Lily's eye level, her expensive clothes incongruous in the modest kitchen, her manicured hands trembling slightly. "Yes," she said simply, meeting the girl's gaze with absolute honesty. "I'm very sad, and I'm scared." "Me too," Lily replied, as if this was a common experience they could bond over. "I'm sad about my mum. She's in heaven, but I miss her every day. Sometimes I miss her so much it feels like I can't breathe." She paused, considering Sophia with the seriousness of a judge. "Do you have a mum?" "I do," Sophia said softly, and there was deep longing in her voice. "But I can't see her right now. It's not safe." Lily nodded like she understood completely, like she'd spent 7 years understanding things children should never have to understand. "Do you have a dog?" she asked. "I do," Sophia said, and a small smile played at her lips. "His name is Maxwell. He's sleeping by the fire." "Can I see him?" Lily asked, and without waiting for an answer, she pulled off her backpack and grabbed Sophia's hand. "Come on, we can be sad together. Dogs are really good at helping when you're sad. Daddy says Maxwell has a special gift for knowing when people need comfort." That was how it started. Lily decided, with the absolute authority of a child who'd known loss, that she was going to befriend Sophia. She brought Sophia books to read, a collection of children's stories that she'd loved when she was younger. She taught Sophia the game they played every afternoon, a pretend game about a magical forest where sad people could go to heal, where animals were always kind, where nobody ever left. She drew pictures for Sophia, simple crayon drawings of the 3 of them and Maxwell together, and put them on the refrigerator with magnets. Maxwell, for his part, seemed to understand that Sophia was emotionally fragile. The dog, sensing that this woman was broken in ways that matched his own brokenness, gravitated toward her constantly, resting his golden head on her lap with the weight of genuine affection, his brown eyes gentle and impossibly understanding. When Sophia would wake up in the middle of the night from nightmares, Maxwell would already be beside her bed, his presence wordless comfort. Lily would sit next to Sophia on the couch, holding her hand without speaking, sometimes falling asleep against her shoulder, just being present, just letting Sophia know that she wasn't alone. And slowly, Sophia learned what it felt like to be needed, to be chosen, to be wanted by someone with no agenda or expectation beyond just being loved. Jesse watched this dynamic develop over the next week with a mix of concern and amazement. He'd been terrified that Lily's presence would make everything more complicated, that Sophia would feel like an intruder in their space, that having a stranger in the house would disrupt the careful balance he'd built between being a father and being a person. Instead, the three of them, Jesse, Lily, and Sophia, fell into a strange new rhythm that almost felt natural, like they'd been waiting their whole lives for someone to complete the pattern. Lily blossomed in ways he hadn't expected. She was more confident, more open, more willing to share her sadness about her mother with someone who understood what it felt like to lose everything. Sophia became a mirror of her pain, and in witnessing that understanding, Lily learned that her grief didn't make her broken, it made her human. During the day, while Lily was at school, Jesse helped Sophia secure her evidence. She'd hidden her laptop and copies of files in encrypted cloud storage before she fled her home. Jesse had her walk him through everything, his military mind organizing it all into a coherent narrative that would be undeniable to law enforcement and impossible to dismiss. Financial transactions that traced money from political accounts through shell companies to offshore banks. Email chains that showed explicit discussions of corruption and cover-ups. Recordings of conversations where the congressman discussed payment for making problems disappear. Documents that detailed bribes, kickbacks, and quid pro quo arrangements that would make a prosecutor's eyes light up. It was extensive, detailed, and absolutely incriminating. "We go to the FBI," Jesse said, reviewing the materials on the secure laptop he'd purchased from a Best Buy 2 towns over, paying cash and using a burner phone to set up the account. "We don't go to local police. Too much chance of corruption, too many connections your ex-husband might have cultivated. We go straight to the federal level, straight to the people with the resources and authority to actually investigate this." "I tried," Sophia said wearily, her eyes haunted by the memory. "I made a call 2 weeks ago, explained everything to an agent, told him what I had. The FBI was supposed to meet me at a safe location. But before that meeting could happen, I was arrested for trespassing at my own house. When I was released, I found evidence that my husband had been in contact with the agent I'd called. Not just in contact, he'd convinced the agent that I was making things up, that I was suffering from a mental break, that any evidence I had would be unreliable because it had come from someone who was psychologically unstable. That's when I knew I couldn't trust anyone in the system." Jesse felt his jaw clench, his hands curling into fists. This was worse than he'd thought, far worse. The corruption ran deep enough that federal law enforcement couldn't be trusted, that the system itself had been compromised at the highest levels, which meant they needed a different strategy, a way to force the system to act, because ignoring the evidence would be worse than admitting what had happened. "What about a lawyer?" he suggested, though even as he said it, he was already realizing the answer. Sophia laughed bitterly, the sound broken and harsh. "My husband is a United States congressman. Every major law firm in D.C. has worked with him, donated to his campaigns, or is hoping to in the future. I made calls to 3 different attorneys. Each of them seemed interested until I told them who I was fleeing from. Suddenly they were unavailable. Suddenly they had conflicts of interest. Suddenly they weren't taking new cases. I can't trust the legal system either. Jesse understood then that Sophia had been boxed in completely. Every institution that should have protected her had been compromised or was complicit. She needed someone outside the system, someone who didn't exist in her world and therefore couldn't be controlled or threatened or bought. She needed someone who still had a moral code that mattered more than safety, more than profit, more than position. She needed him. The threat came to his doorstep exactly 10 days after Sophia arrived at the farmhouse. 10 days of them building something that felt almost like normalcy despite the danger underneath. Jesse was at work, cleaning offices in Richmond, using the night shifts to secure income while the days were free for protecting Sophia, when his phone rang. It was the school, and his heart nearly stopped when they told him that Lily had been picked up early from class by a woman claiming to be her aunt. But Jesse didn't have a sister, and the description of the woman didn't match anyone in his family. Older, stern-faced, professionally dressed, carrying identification that looked official but felt wrong. His heart nearly stopped, then shifted into overdrive. This was it. This was the moment where everything moved from theoretical danger to active threat. His daughter had been taken. They were using Lily as leverage, as pressure, as a way to force Sophia out into the open. He was in his truck in under 5 seconds, calling his backup plan as he drove. Mrs. Patterson, his neighbor 2 houses down, was the only person who knew about Sophia. He'd prepared for this exact scenario. If something went wrong, if Lily was ever taken, Mrs. Patterson was supposed to go immediately to the school, verify the situation, and take custody of Lily if she was still there. She had Lily now, along with specific instructions. If Jesse didn't check in every hour, call the police and tell them his daughter had been picked up without authorization. It was a desperate move, but it bought him time. Mrs. Patterson was ex-military herself, understood the significance of what he'd asked, and hadn't asked questions. But Jesse's real terror was directed at the farmhouse. Sophia was there alone, with Maxwell, but alone, vulnerable. And if they'd taken Lily as leverage, if they'd used his daughter as bait, he couldn't finish the thought because his mind was already shifting into tactical override, the part of him that was trained to operate under maximum stress, maximum risk, maximum emotion compartmentalized into mission focus. He made it back in 17 minutes, taking corners at speeds that should have gotten him arrested if anyone had been there to see him. His hands gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white again, just like they had in that hospital parking lot. The farmhouse looked normal from the road, smoke rising from the chimney, lights on inside, but his military instincts screamed that something was wrong. The normal concealed the dangerous. Jesse didn't use the front door. He approached from the tree line instead, moving carefully through the late afternoon shadows, his mind in full tactical mode. He could see into the sitting room through the window, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Sophia was standing with a man on either side of her, both tall, both wearing the kind of dark tactical gear that screamed professional security or military background. They were professionals, hired men with experience and training, the kind of people who were paid to do things that ordinary men wouldn't do. But Sophia's face showed no fear, Jesse realized with a start. She stood between them with her head up, her shoulders squared, defiant, and Jesse understood in that moment that she wasn't the fragile woman who'd asked, "Please don't hurt us," in the darkness of his farmhouse. Somewhere in the past 10 days, as she'd healed under Lily's care and Maxwell's love and Jesse's protection, she'd become something harder. She'd reclaimed something of herself. She'd become someone willing to fight. Jesse moved silently around the back of the house, entering through the kitchen door he'd left unlocked earlier that morning. Old military habits, always maintain an exit, always have a way out. He moved with the deliberate quiet of someone who'd trained for years in silent entry, his footfalls soundless against the hardwood floor, his breathing controlled and shallow. He cleared each room as he passed through, a habit from combat operations, assessing for secondary threats, checking sightlines, identifying potential danger before it could manifest. The sounds of conversation grew clearer as he moved through the rooms, his body automatically shifting into tactical positions, his breathing controlled and silent, his mind already calculating angles and reaction times. "Your husband is offering you one chance," one of the men was saying. His accent was faintly Eastern European, probably private military contractor, the kind of man who'd been trained to follow orders and not ask questions, who'd worked in multiple conflict zones, whose conscience had been trained out of him long ago. "You come with us quietly. You'll be taken somewhere comfortable. He's willing to work something out, maybe an institution, a few years of evaluation. Then you get your life back. All he needs is your cooperation. All he needs is for you to understand that fighting this is pointless. His legal team will make sure your case is airtight. You'll be officially declared incompetent, all your assets transferred to his control, all your communications monitored, but at least you'll be alive." "No," Sophia said flatly. Her voice was steady, her eyes unafraid. Jessie could see her tactical assessment in the way she held herself. She was buying time, waiting, hoping that somehow help would come. "Tell him no. Tell him I'm never coming with you. Tell him I'd rather die than spend one more second in his orbit. And tell him that the evidence he's so desperately searching for, it's already gone. It's already in places he can't reach. Every financial transaction, every email, every recording. It's encrypted and distributed across servers in 5 different countries. If anything happens to me, if I disappear or die or have an accident, it all goes public automatically. He can't stop it. He can't control it. He can't make it disappear." The second man, younger, less experienced, tensed at this information. He looked at his partner, silently asking the question, "Did you know about this?" The older man didn't answer, maintaining his professional composure, but Jessie could see the calculation shift in his eyes. "Mrs. Brooks," the man began, taking a step closer. "Miss Brooks," she corrected coldly, "and my answer is still no." Jessie stepped into the doorway of the sitting room, making himself visible. Both men's hands moved immediately toward their waistbands, a trained response, but Jessie's voice cut through the tension like a blade, clear and certain, the voice of someone who'd given combat orders and been obeyed. "She said no," he said quietly, "so you're going to leave now." The 2 men assessed him instantly. They were professionals, highly trained, experienced in evaluating threats. They saw a man in his late 30s, physically fit and muscular, calm under pressure, the kind of bearing that suggested serious military training. Navy SEAL training specifically, they probably recognized. His hands were empty, but positioned for rapid access to weapons. His stance was open, but tactically sound. His eyes were completely steady, showing no fear or uncertainty. One of them, the older of the 2, seemed to recognize exactly what he was looking at. "This isn't your situation," the first man said, his hand still near his waistband, trying to maintain tactical advantage through threat assessment. "This is a private family matter. You need to step aside." "It is my situation now," Jessie replied, his voice ice-cold with absolute certainty. His hand moved toward his jacket in a deliberate motion, slow enough to look non-aggressive, but fast enough that if he needed to escalate, he could do so in half a second. "You have 10 seconds to leave this property. After that, I'm calling the police and reporting an attempted kidnapping. Your employer has a lot of resources, but he doesn't have the kind of reach to clean up a crime scene in rural Virginia, where the sheriff's department has nothing but time and suspicion. Rural cops love cases like this. High profile, federal implications, national attention. Killing me here would create exactly the kind of investigation your boss can't control. It's bad for business. It was a bluff, sort of. Jesse had no illusions that the congressman couldn't have this whole situation buried, evidence destroyed, witnesses intimidated, police investigations derailed. But what the man didn't know was that Jesse wasn't trying to defeat him in court or convince the legal system. He was trying to buy time and make the risk assessment unfavorable. Hired men like this worked on cost-benefit analysis, on the mathematical probability of success versus consequences. A struggle in a rural farmhouse against a trained SEAL who clearly knew what he was doing, with police response guaranteed within 10 minutes due to an automatic call system he'd obviously set up in advance, with the job becoming exponentially more complicated, with the employer potentially abandoning them to save his own skin if things went wrong. That made the calculation unfavorable. A simple snatch and grab became a complicated situation that could get them killed or imprisoned. Their payment wasn't high enough for that level of risk. The first man held Jesse's gaze for a long moment, his hand still near his waistband, clearly doing the math. His eyes flickered between Jesse and Sophia, assessing the situation one more time. Then, very slowly, he withdrew his hand. He made a small gesture to his partner, a motion that said, "Let's go," a command that communicated professional respect for a tactical situation that had shifted beyond their control. Without another word, both men turned and walked out of the house. Jesse followed them, maintaining sightlines, until they were in their SUV. Jesse heard their truck start, heard it drive away down the long driveway, kicking up gravel and dust. He watched the taillights disappear into the gathering dusk. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. Only then did he register that his hands were shaking, that his heart was pounding, that the adrenaline surge was overwhelming his training for a moment. Sophia crossed the space between them and threw her arms around him. She was shaking, not with fear but with something else. A kind of desperate relief that said she'd been holding it together on pure willpower, that she'd been terrified they were going to take her again, that she'd been one moment away from having to fight back and knowing she'd lose. "Thank you," Sophia whispered. "Thank you for coming back. I thought—" "Shh," Jesse said, holding her tighter. "You're safe. They're gone." But he knew, even as he said it, that this was far from over. If anything, his intervention had escalated the situation. The congressman would know now that Sophia had protection, that she had help, that she wasn't alone. The next move would be more aggressive, more dangerous, more final. They weren't trying to kidnap her anymore. They were trying to eliminate her as a problem. He needed to shift his strategy immediately. When Lily came home an hour later, it was with Mrs. Patterson looking shaken and worried. But Lily herself seemed fine, almost calm. She explained that a nice lady had come to pick her up, saying she was Jesse's friend, and that they had a surprise planned. Lily had almost gotten in the car before Mrs. Patterson arrived at the school to verify. When she couldn't confirm the woman's identity, she'd taken Lily anyway. Jesse held his daughter, feeling the reality of how close he'd come to losing her crash over him like a wave. This was no longer theoretical. This was no longer a situation they could handle by staying quiet. They needed to go on the offensive, and Jesse needed to use every single skill from his Navy SEAL training to make sure they won. He put Lily to bed that night with extra stories, extra hugs, extra reassurance that she was safe, that nobody would take her, that he would never let anything happen to her. He sat with her until she fell asleep, watching her small face, feeling the weight of what he'd committed to when he decided to help Sophia. The next morning, after Lily left for school, Jesse sat down with Sophia and showed her his plan. It wasn't complicated. The best operations never were, and Jesse had been trained by the best. "We release the evidence," he said, spreading out the files on the laptop. "Not to law enforcement, where it can be buried or lost or explained away. We release it to every major news organization simultaneously. We make it impossible to suppress. We make your ex-husband's crimes front-page news in every major outlet in America. The Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, NPR, major news stations in every state. We go nuclear." Sophia stared at the files with an expression Jessie couldn't quite read. Hope and fear warred in her eyes. "He'll know it was me," she said quietly. "Yeah," Jessie acknowledged. "He'll know. But once it's public, once every news organization in the country is running the story, killing you becomes counterproductive. Dead whistleblowers get investigated. Their deaths get scrutinized. Their evidence gets given weight by their sacrifice. But a live whistleblower can be sued, intimidated, pressured. The system prefers live problems to dead ones. And most importantly, he'll be desperate and out in the open. And desperation makes people make mistakes." "And what about you and Lily?" Sophia asked quietly, her voice full of concern. "Releasing this information makes you visible too. Makes your daughter visible. He has resources." "He does," Jessie agreed. "He has money and connections and power within certain systems. But I have something he doesn't have. I'm not bound by the same rules he is. I don't have constituents or campaign donors to answer to. I don't have a career that can be destroyed by scandal. I don't have political allies who might abandon me if the pressure gets too high. I'm just a guy with military training and a moral code and a willingness to do what it takes to protect my daughter and you." Sophia studied his face like she was seeing him for the first time, understanding the depth of what he was committing to. "You mean that?" she said. "I do," he said simply. It took 2 days to prepare the release. Jessie had connections from his military days, men and women he'd served with who'd left the military and built different lives in different sectors. A journalist friend from SEAL Team 3 was now an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, someone Jessie trusted completely. A former commanding officer had gone into corporate security, but still believed in justice and still answered Jessie's calls at 2 in the morning. They wanted the evidence carefully vetted before release, wanted to ensure every accusation was backed by documentation, wanted to make sure the story would hold up against the inevitable counterattack and legal challenge. During those 2 days, something crystallized between Jessie and Sophia that had been building since the moment he'd first seen her in his farmhouse, terrified and desperate and unwilling to let go of her dog. It wasn't just physical attraction, though there was plenty of that. Sophia was beautiful and intelligent and fierce beneath her fear, and Jessie found himself drawn to her in ways that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. She had intelligence that cut through propaganda and complexity, strength that endured under pressure, and a vulnerability that she'd slowly revealed as the days passed. She would laugh at Lily's jokes, and the sound of it would catch Jessie's breath. She would stroke Maxwell's fur, and her entire body would soften into gentleness. It was something deeper than attraction. It was recognition. Recognition that they were both survivors, both people who'd been broken by circumstances beyond their control and had learned to rebuild themselves from the pieces. Recognition that they fit together in a way that made the broken parts whole, that filled in the empty spaces that loss had created. She understood what it meant to carry the weight of impossible choices. He understood what it meant to trust again when trust had been shattered. There were moments in those weeks that felt like dating, like falling in love in the normal way. Jessie would catch Sophia smiling at him over morning coffee, and his heart would skip. She would watch him work on the house, fixing things with his hands, and he'd feel her gaze and look up to find her expression unguarded and full of something he recognized as admiration. They'd sit on the porch in the evenings while Lily was asleep, talking about nothing and everything, building a connection that felt like two people finding solid ground after years of drowning. They didn't make love until the night before the evidence was released. It happened not as a conscious decision, but as an inevitability, like gravity, like coming home, like two broken people discovering they could be whole together. They were in the sitting room after Lily was asleep, Maxwell stretched across the back of the couch, the fire burning low, casting everything in warm golden light. Jesse had been reviewing the final technical details of the release plan, making sure every precaution had been taken, his mind occupied with contingencies and worst-case scenarios, when Sophia came and sat beside him. She didn't say anything at first. She just put her hand on his arm, and Jesse felt the weight of that simple touch like an anchor. "I'm terrified," she said quietly. "I know," he replied, turning to face her. "But we've got this. Your evidence is solid. The journalists have vetted everything. The timing is set. Tomorrow morning." "Not of what comes next," she interrupted, and her eyes were locked on his. "I'm terrified of losing this, losing you, losing what we've built here. For the past 2 weeks, I felt something I thought was gone forever. Safety, peace, the possibility of happiness. And tomorrow, all of that might explode. You could become a target just by being associated with me. Lily could become vulnerable. Jesse, I don't know if I can bear being the reason something happens to your daughter." Jesse reached up and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, feeling the warmth of her skin. "Listen to me," he said. "You're not the reason for anything bad that's happened. Your ex-husband is. The system that protected him is. But you're the reason this is about to change. You're the reason justice is coming. Yes, there's risk. Yes, there's uncertainty. But that's the price of doing the right thing. And I would take that price 1,000 times over to be here with you and Lily and Maxwell, to have found you, to have this." He moved closer, his hand still cradling her face. "You won't lose this," he said. "I promise you. Whatever comes next, we face it together. You're not alone anymore." And then he kissed her, and the rest of the world fell away. Their kiss was tentative at first, a question and an answer, a promise and an acceptance. Then deeper, more urgent, their hands finding each other in the darkness, their bodies remembering what it felt like to be wanted, to be safe with another person, to be truly seen and accepted. Sophia's hands found the warmth of his skin beneath his shirt. Jesse drew her closer, feeling the reality of her, the solidity of her presence. They made love there on the couch by the firelight, their connection silent and deep. Two people discovering that healing and love could happen simultaneously, that broken people could create something whole together. The next morning, when the evidence went public, it was like detonating a bomb inside the Capitol building. The Washington Post published an 8,000-word investigative article with hundreds of pages of supporting documents. Within an hour, every news organization in the country was following the story. The congressman's face was on every television screen, his alleged crimes laid bare and impossible to deny. Financial corruption, money laundering, conspiracy, abuse of power, attempted murder. By midday, federal agents had moved on his office, armed with search warrants, removing boxes of documents and servers. By evening, he was being arrested at his home. Perp walked past cameras with his hands in cuffs, his political career ending in real time on national television. But the story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was entering its most dangerous phase. The congressman's people scrambled to salvage what they could, to threaten reporters, to intimidate witnesses. Multiple sources reported attempted bribes and threats to journalists who were investigating the story. Law enforcement uncovered evidence that he'd been planning to flee the country before his arrest, that he'd already transferred millions in assets to accounts in countries without extradition treaties. Most disturbingly, security footage from the farmhouse driveway showed a second team of armed men arriving at the property late that evening, clearly with instructions that went beyond kidnapping. These men came with intention that was final. This was the moment Jesse had been preparing for his entire life. While Sophia and Lily were sheltered with trusted friends, Mrs. Patterson had arrangements with a safe house run by a women's organization that specialized in protecting people from abuse. Jesse waited in the farmhouse, mentally preparing himself for the endgame. He reviewed his tactical options, mapped the property, identified defensive positions, calculated engagement angles. He called his old SEAL commander and gave him specific instructions. If he didn't check in within 48 hours, everything, all of Sophia's evidence, all of her story, all of their situation, would go public immediately. When the men came, they came in darkness. 3 black SUVs rolling up to the farmhouse at midnight. Jesse was waiting. He'd booby-trapped nothing. He refused to risk civilian casualties, but he'd positioned himself with maximum defensive advantage. There were 4 of them, heavily armed, moving with tactical precision that suggested private military contractor training, experience in combat operations. They had night vision, suppressed weapons, radio communication, and the confidence of men who believed they were coming to execute an unsuspecting target in an isolated location. They didn't expect to find resistance. They expected to find a farmhouse with a single woman, alone and vulnerable. What they found was a man with 20 years of Navy SEAL combat training, fighting for everything he loved. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't the kind of thing that would ever be on television or talked about in polite conversation. Jesse moved through that farmhouse like an instrument of precision and control. The first man came through the front door, and Jesse disabled him with a strike to the solar plexus, followed by a leg sweep. The man was on his back, gasping for air, his weapon falling away before he even understood what had happened. The second man, hearing the commotion, came through the kitchen door. Jesse met him with a lock that dislocated the man's elbow, forcing him to drop his weapon, followed by 3 precise strikes that left him unconscious on the floor. The third man managed to get 1 shot off, a suppressed round that went through the kitchen window, before Jesse was on him, using the man's own momentum against him, using leverage and technique against raw strength, leaving him broken but alive on the ground. The fourth man, the professional, the leader, actually attempted to talk to Jesse, to reason with him, to convince him that fighting this was pointless. Jesse responded by methodically advancing on him, cutting off every escape route, boxing him into the corner, and finishing the engagement with a submission hold that rendered the man unconscious without permanent injury. Jesse held the position long enough to confirm unconsciousness, then released and checked each man for weapons, securing them, ensuring none of them could rouse and continue the fight. When the dust cleared and local law enforcement arrived, summoned by Jesse's emergency call, every one of the men was apprehended without a shot being fired. 3 of them had serious injuries but were stable. 1 of them had a dislocated elbow that would require surgery. None of them would ever fully return to active military contractor work, but they would live and they would face justice. Jesse's training had taught him how to disable, incapacitate, and remove threats with overwhelming precision and control. He'd used every single bit of that training, and he'd done it without crossing the line into lethal force. The line had been razor thin, had required absolute discipline and complete mastery of his body and his training, but he'd held it. The federal investigation expanded then. What had started as a financial crimes case now included conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, organized crime connections, and charges that kept piling up like snow in a blizzard. The congressman fought back through expensive lawyers and every corrupt contact he'd ever cultivated, but the evidence was undeniable. Sophia's documentation was meticulous. The attempted murders were backed by surveillance footage. The money trails led to people in federal prison, people who were suddenly very willing to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. 2 months after the story broke, The congressman was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison for financial crimes, conspiracy, and attempted murder. His co-conspirators were convicted one by one. The investigation uncovered an entire network of corruption that reached into multiple government agencies, multiple corporations, and multiple countries. People who'd protected him, people who'd helped him hide his crimes, people who'd participated in his schemes, they all started falling as the pressure increased. Sophia became a symbol of whistleblower courage. She gave interviews carefully vetted by her legal team, told her story without flinching, and used her platform to advocate for stronger protections for people trying to report corruption. She testified before Congress about the need for witness protection programs that actually functioned, about the necessity of separating law enforcement investigations from political pressure. Her tech company, which she'd feared was destroyed by association with scandal, experienced an unexpected renaissance as clients, and investors rallied to support her. Tech industry leaders publicly endorsed her. Venture capitalists called with offers to expand her company. Universities asked her to lecture about cybersecurity and ethics. The public loved a story about a woman standing up to corruption, about David defeating Goliath, about the system actually working when enough light was shined on the darkness. She could have gone back to her old life, back to California and board meetings and the power structures she'd been part of before. Corporate boards wanted her. The woman who'd exposed a congressman, the entrepreneur with a $200 million company. She could have rebuilt her company, expanded it, made herself even richer and more powerful. She could have left Lily, left Jesse, left the farmhouse, and gone back to the life that had been waiting for her. Her mother, whom she'd been separated from, reached out and wanted to reconcile. Her father, estranged for years, sent letters of apology and request for forgiveness. Instead, she chose to stay. It happened slowly, not as a dramatic decision, but as a series of quiet choices that accumulated over time. She hired someone to run her company remotely, someone she trusted to make decisions in her absence, to expand the business while she focused on healing and building a life. She rented an apartment in the nearest town to be closer to Lily's school, close enough to be present in her daughter's life, but far enough away that she had her own space, her own sanctuary, where she could process everything that had happened. She started volunteering with the women's organization that had helped her escape, teaching other survivors how to document evidence, how to protect themselves, how to fight back against the people who wanted to silence them. She began healing. 3 months after the congressman's conviction, Lily came home from school and asked a question that stopped both Jesse and Sophia in their tracks. They were in the kitchen. Jesse was making dinner. Sophia was helping Lily with her homework, when Lily suddenly looked up from her math worksheet. "Are you going to marry Sophia?" Lily asked, looking between them with the straightforward logic of a 7-year-old who understood the important things in life better than most adults. "Because I think you should. Maxwell thinks so too." Maxwell, hearing his name, lifted his head from his dog bed and wagged his tail enthusiastically, as if voting yes to the proposal. Jesse and Sophia looked at each other across the kitchen table. There was no pressure in the moment, just honest assessment. Over the past 3 months, they'd become a family. Not just in the romance sense, though there was absolutely romance. There were stolen kisses in the kitchen when Lily was upstairs, knowing looks across dinner tables, nights when they fell asleep intertwined like they'd been designed to fit together. But they were a family in the deeper sense. 3 people and a dog who chose each other every day, who protected each other, who made each other whole, who understood each other's broken places and loved each other anyway. "Yeah," Jesse said, looking at his daughter, then at Sophia. "I think I should." He didn't have a ring yet. Jesse hadn't had time to think about jewelry or planning or any of the formal structures that society had built around marriage, but he didn't need a ring for what came next. He reached across the table and took Sophia's hand, their fingers intertwining, his dark eyes meeting her lighter ones with all the intention and certainty of a man who'd found his purpose. "Sophia Brooks," he said, his voice steady and sure, carrying the weight of everything they'd survived together. "I love you. I've known you for 3 months, and I can't imagine my life without you. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. You're braver. You make my daughter laugh, and you make me believe in second chances. Will you marry me?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that transformed her entire face into pure joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." Lily cheered from her chair, and Maxwell jumped up barking, and somehow in the midst of the celebration, with his daughter laughing and his future wife crying happy tears and his dog spinning in circles, Jesse felt his entire life shift into alignment. The broken pieces of who he'd been, the Navy SEAL, the grieving widower, the single father struggling in the dark, weren't just healed. They were transformed into something stronger and more beautiful than they'd been before. The wedding happened 5 months later in the spring, with the farmhouse as the backdrop and the Virginia countryside in full bloom. They'd completely renovated the house by then, new roof, updated electrical that met code, fresh plumbing, a complete kitchen makeover, new flooring throughout. The exterior had received a fresh coat of paint in soft ivory with black trim and white shutters. The front steps had new flower beds where Lily had planted tulips and daffodils, where butterflies would visit in the warm months. The property was still rural and isolated, still far from civilization, but it wasn't abandoned anymore. It was home. It was sanctuary. It was the place where 2 broken people had found each other and learned to believe in wholeness again. Sophia wore a simple white dress that didn't hide the curves of her body, or the strength in her posture, that showed the woman she was, not delicate or helpless, but capable and real and beautiful in an authentic way. Jesse wore a dark suit that brought out his eyes, standing at the altar with his hands steady, his expression open and honest. And between them, standing as an essential part of this union, was Lily in a pale blue dress, holding Maxwell's leash. The justice of the peace was a woman from town who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of it. The reception was small, just the closest friends and family, including Mrs. Patterson and the volunteers from the women's organization who'd helped Sophia escape, who'd sheltered her and Lily and Maxwell, while Jesse faced down the men who'd come for them. A local caterer provided food that was simple and delicious. Someone had strung lights across the farmyard. And when Jesse kissed his new wife as the sun set over the Virginia hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, it felt like something sacred had occurred. Not just the legal formality of marriage, but the completion of a journey they'd all taken together, the full circle of loss and fear and danger transformed into love and safety and hope. 1 year later, standing on the same front porch where Sophia had hidden in fear on that bitter February night, Jesse watched his family. Lily was 8 now, almost 9, tall and confident and kind, in a way that suggested Emma's soul had somehow found its way into her. She had Emma's curiosity, Emma's capacity for love, Emma's determination to see the good in people, even when the world gave her reasons not to. She was teaching Maxwell a new trick. The dog was getting older, his golden coat greying around the muzzle, his breathing slightly laboured after a year of warmth and safety and love, but his eyes were bright and eager and full of joy. The dog who'd saved Sophia's life with a perfectly timed seizure was now the patriarch of this new family, respected and loved, his presence essential to their healing. Sophia stood beside Lily, her arm around their daughter, laughing at something Lily had just said, her face open and happy in a way Jesse had never seen during those first terrifying days. The fear was gone, replaced by confidence and peace, and the kind of joy that comes from knowing you made the right choice, even when that choice was the hardest thing you ever did. She'd won her legal battle. The congressman was serving his sentence, and appeals were being systematically denied by judges who'd reviewed the evidence and found it overwhelming. The women whose lives had been destroyed by his corruption were testifying at sentencing hearings. The witnesses who'd disappeared were being found and given second chances at normal lives. She'd established a non-profit that helped corporate whistleblowers document and report crimes safely, that provided legal support and protection to people trying to do the right thing. She'd become an advocate for policy change, testifying before Congress about the need for stronger protections for people who reported corruption. She'd become living proof that speaking truth to power was possible, that one person with courage could change everything. But the most profound change was simpler than all of that. She'd become happy, not in a naive or temporary way, but in the deep, resilient way that comes from survival, from being known completely and loved anyway, from having a home and a family that chose her every single day, from knowing that the worst thing she'd feared happening had happened, and she'd survived it and become stronger. Jesse pulled up a chair and joined them on the porch, settling into the warmth of the late afternoon sun. He wasn't a Navy SEAL anymore. That identity belonged to a different version of himself, a man who'd been shaped by war and trained for combat. He was someone new now. He was a husband. He was a father. He was a man who'd used his skills to protect the vulnerable, and that felt more like purpose than any military mission ever had. Maxwell rested his grey muzzle on Jesse's knee, and Jesse scratched the dog's ears, feeling the warmth of the sun and the presence of his family. This was what he'd been working toward since the night he'd bought the farmhouse, a place of safety, of belonging, of love without fear. This was what second chances looked like when they were real and true and built on sacrifice and commitment. Lily ran inside to get something she'd forgotten for dinner prep. Sophia reached over and squeezed Jesse's hand, their fingers intertwining like they'd learned to do 1,000 times in the past year, like this gesture had become a language all its own. No words were necessary. They'd been through too much together, survived too much, and built too much to need words anymore. "I was thinking," Sophia said quietly after a moment, "about what comes next." "What do you mean?" Jesse asked, though he had a feeling he knew. "I mean, we have the farmhouse," she said, gesturing toward the restored home behind them. "We have Lily. We have Maxwell. We have this life we've built together. What if we had a baby? Our baby?" Jesse felt his breath catch, felt emotion rise up in his throat. He thought about it. A child born from their love, who would grow up knowing both parents, who would never have to navigate loss the way Lily had. A brother or sister for Lily. An expansion of the family they'd created out of crisis and desperation and hope. A new beginning, truly, without the shadows of the past hanging over it. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah, I'd like that." Sophia smiled, that same beautiful smile that had first told him he could love again, that told him happiness wasn't just possible, but real, and Jesse pulled her close, his arm around her, the dog still resting against his leg, the sun still warming the porch of the farmhouse that had been the center of their redemption. The story of how Sophia Brooks and Jesse Carter found each other was a story about second chances. It was a story about how sometimes the most broken people, brought together by circumstance and danger, can build something whole that's stronger than either of them could have been alone. It was a story about how a simple farmhouse in rural Virginia became sanctuary, and how love, when it's real and tested by fire, can conquer everything: corruption, fear, loss, injustice, and the weight of the past. And Maxwell, the dog who'd started everything, who'd triggered Sophia's escape by having a seizure at exactly the right moment, who'd protected Sophia when she had no one else, who'd bonded Lily and Sophia when they needed each other most, wagged his tail in the golden evening light, content in the knowledge that he'd played his own essential role in bringing this family into being. He'd been the bridge between two broken people that helped them believe in wholeness again. As the evening deepened and the family moved inside to prepare dinner together, Sophia setting the table with the dishes they'd slowly accumulated over the year, Lily mixing salad ingredients under Jessie's watchful eye, Maxwell waiting hopefully in case anyone dropped something, the farmhouse was exactly what it was meant to be, not just a building with walls and a roof, but a home, a place where love was real, where trust had been earned through sacrifice, where a second chance at family had been seized and made into something beautiful. Years later, when Sophia and Jessie's daughter Emma was born, named after Jessie's first wife in honor of the past and the woman she'd been, the farmhouse felt complete in a way it never had before. Little Emma, with her mother's intelligent eyes and her father's steady strength, would grow up knowing a different kind of family, one built not on biological accident, but on choice, on commitment, on the understanding that family is what you create when you choose to love, despite the risk. And when the teenage Lily, looking after her little sister, walked with Maxwell through the fields where wildflowers grew in the spring, where butterflies visited the flowers Lily had planted years before, and little Emma laughed at the dog's antics, and Jessie and Sophia watched from the porch, they all understood something fundamental about how life works. The worst things that happen to us don't have to define our futures. The darkness we survive can teach us to recognize and protect others moving through darkness. And the people we find in our lowest moments, when we have nothing left but honesty, can become the people we build our entire lives around. That was the real story, not the corruption or the crime or the danger. All of that was just the vehicle that brought two people together who were ready to believe in love again. The real story was a farmhouse in Virginia, a man with a haunted past learning to smile again, a woman with courage in her bones learning to rest, a girl with an open heart learning that families could expand and deepen, and a dog who'd been saved from darkness finding purpose in saving everyone he loved. The story was hope, and it was real.